Hello. Thank you so much for volunteering to take part in the 2023 Indiana Bumblebee Photo Survey, organized by Purdue University and ESI. In these training videos, you will learn all the necessary information to participate in this survey, or if you have already attended an in-person training session, you can revisit this information on your own time as a refresher. First of all, who are we? This survey is being organized by Robert Jean of Environmental Solutions and Innovations and myself, Hannah Kernan of Purdue University. My name's Hannah. I'm a graduate student in the Department of Entomology at Purdue University. I'm part of Dr. Ian Kaplan's Insect Ecology Lab, and my research is concerned with long-term ecological changes in Indiana bumblebees. Part of my research involves collecting data from historic preserved specimens, which is what you can see me doing in this picture here on the right. But I'm also interested in learning about our bumblebee populations as they exist right now. And so Rob and I started this collaboration because Rob is our leading bee expert here in the state of Indiana and has been working for a long time towards the goal of establishing a statewide bee survey. And we're hoping that this initiative here will be a significant first step towards achieving that goal. But we have multiple goals that we're hoping to achieve with this photo survey. First, projects like these are perfect for involving community science. We're always looking for ways to include folks from Indiana in our research on native pollinators. Our primary research goal is to produce a status check on Indiana bumblebees, basically to determine the relative rarity of each species found within the state. And as part of the status check, we'll be determining the range limits of these species, as well as habitat conditions that are supportive of bumblebees. There's not been much modern research on Indiana bumblebees, and many of these important facts are not currently known. And lastly, our long-term goal is that by making this status check, we can create a baseline from which we can reference in years to come. And this way, we can track changes in bumblebee populations as they happen in real time. Now, we wouldn't be doing all of this if bumblebees were not extremely important. And hopefully, if you're already watching this video, then you agree that they are worth protecting. But let's talk about a few specific reasons why we should care so much about bumblebees. First, as we all know, bumblebees are critical pollinators, and we rely on their pollination services in many areas of our lives. Many species of crops and wild plants rely heavily on bumblebee pollination to grow and reproduce. And as we'll talk a bit about more later, not all bees pollinate all plants, and to support our diverse community of plants, we need that diverse community of bees. But bumblebees, they do so much more than just support our plant community. I always like to remember that bumblebees have so much worth outside of what they can provide for us with pollination, and that the holistic role that they play in our local wildlife communities cannot be forgotten. And of course, the inspiration for this survey and many other similar surveys around the country are the concerning declines that have been seen in bumblebee populations throughout the past several decades. Bee declines in general have been reported across taxonomic groups, across the entire world, and there are several factors that have been identified as contributing to these declines. Now, these factors are very complicated and do depend on when and where we're looking at declines, but to sum things up, here are 4 major risk factors that are known to be harmful to bumblebees. First off is habitat loss, primarily in the form of the loss of floral resources and the conversion to agricultural landscapes. There's been major habitat loss for native bees, especially in this part of the country, for since the early 1900s, much of our natural spaces have been converted to farmland. And while this farmland can potentially be a source of food for bumblebees, we'll talk about some crops that are very important for bumblebees and vice versa. Agricultural fields do not provide the range of sources for pollen and nectar throughout the entire year that bumblebees need to survive. Next, pathogens. Several pathogens and parasites have become more prevalent in wild bee populations, notably mites, and diseases such as nosema are an example. Many of these diseases are also found in honeybees, and these can significantly decrease the quality of life for these insects and can lead to many deaths. Exposure to pesticides can also exacerbate several of these issues, contributing to the prevalence of disease, harming the health of bumblebees, and herbicides as well, while not harming bees directly, can secondarily contribute to declines by potentially killing plants that bees need for their floral resources. And lastly, competition. Bumblebees can experience competition for floral resources, not only from honeybees, but from other bumblebees. And this is because, like honeybees, the common eastern bumblebee is often bred and kept at farms and greenhouses for its pollination services. And it's for this reason that the common eastern bumblebee's population has exploded in the United States, and we're seeing this species at very high numbers, often outcompeting other rare species. So let's move on to some bumblebee facts. First off, there are about 25,000 described bee species worldwide, but only 250 of these are bumblebees. North of Mexico, we have 46 bumblebees native to this region, but there potentially could be more. Modern genomic analysis has allowed us to separate cryptic species that could not previously be differentiated, so there may be new species out there that we just aren't aware of yet. Within Indiana, we have 16 native bumblebee species that have been recorded throughout history. For some Indiana-specific facts, like I mentioned, we have 16 native species, though several of them are extremely rare and only known from a few records. Bumblebees are found all across the state, though these range patterns do vary by species. These specific range patterns are one of the things we're hoping to find out through conducting this survey. And in our state, bumblebees are active for almost 8 months out of the year, from about April to November. So they're active for a really long time compared to a lot of other insects. And lastly, bumblebees are important pollinators for several significant Indiana crops, such as processing tomatoes, watermelons, blueberries, and several others. And this is because bumblebees employ a special type of pollination called buzz pollination, which, to simplify things, they're able to vibrate their wing muscles in a way that can coax out pollen from structures that typically hide them within a tube in the flower. So it means they're better at pollinating these types of crops than many other types of bees, including honeybees, are. Now let's talk a little bit about bumblebee biology, because this is actually one of the things that makes bumblebees unique from other bees, specifically including honeybees. So bumblebees operate on an annual cycle, as opposed to honeybees, which can persist year after year. And that cycle begins in the early spring, where queen bumblebees, which have just hibernated, emerge, and they begin to forage to build their nests. They tunnel down into the earth and they lay their eggs, which have been fertilized from the year before. And eventually, throughout the summer and into the fall, these eggs grow into the workers, which emerge and take over that foraging job. And throughout the whole season, the colony thrives and grows until the end of the summer into the fall. That colony will begin to produce males and new queens, which will be the reproductive units for other colonies. The queens will fly off and mate, and then she will find a place to overwinter, build her nest, where throughout the winter she'll hibernate and start that process all over again into the spring. And because bumblebees are active throughout so much of the year, throughout this cycle, they rely on many different plant species that bloom throughout the year to collect the necessary nectar and pollen that they need to live. These are just a few examples of these species, but the big idea here is that bumblebees are generalists, so they can feed on lots of different types of flowers, and this variety is very important for their biology. And the last topic for this first intro section, bumblebees need more than just floral resources. They also need nesting resources to thrive and reproduce. This is one of the areas in bumblebee research that is most lacking in scientific information, because it's notoriously difficult to track bumblebees to their nests or overwintering sites. But we do know that they often take advantage of pre-dug rodent holes or loose wood piles and brush to make their nests. Some species are more likely to nest below ground, while others are more often to nest higher up, and the size of these nests can vary as well. But one thing is that they're very inconspicuous. They're often very difficult to find. But the most important thing that they look for are loose brush areas that they can easily turn out and build their nests. Now that we've learned about bumblebees and their biology, this next section will be about the common species that you're most likely to see here in Indiana, and some useful characteristics that you can use to identify these species. Now, to be clear, identification is not a required part of participating in the survey, so I'll be keeping things brief here, and you can skip this section if you'd like. This is just if you are interested in your own learning. These are things that you can use to start identifying bumblebees in the field. Outside of this video, this here is a really great field guide published by the University of Illinois, hosted at beespotter.org. I think it does a really great job of showing the different color patterns for bumblebees that are found in this area. You can find this on the BeeSpotter website right here, or on our project Google Drive, which I'll introduce later. I already have these available for anybody to download. Before we get into the different species, it's really useful to be able to differentiate between male and female bumblebees. First of all, females are typically found much earlier in the season than males, as males are not usually produced until the end of the summer into the fall, which is when colonies are starting to want to reproduce. So the time of year can be a big clue for if you're seeing a male or a female bee. But aside from this, the main distinguishing features between males and female in the field are the number of abdominal segments and the length of the antennae, as well as the presence or absence of a pollen basket. Males have an extra abdominal segment than females, as well as an extra segment in their antennae, so it appears longer in the field, and their abdomen has more of a pointier, blunter shape, whereas females have the sting at the end. But one of the easiest ways to tell the difference that I tend to go to is that if your bee is collecting pollen into a basket on their hind leg like this, that's how you know it's a female bee. Male bees don't collect pollen like that to bring back to the colony. So if you're looking to tell the difference, think about what time of year it is, how many segments does it have, what's the overall shape of the abdomen, how long are those antennae, and then lastly, does it have this pollen basket? Is it collecting pollen into this little spherical structure on their hind leg? Now, on to the common species, and this first one here is by far the most common. It's even in its name. The common eastern bumblebee is the most popular bee to be found here in Indiana. Like I mentioned earlier in this presentation, it's bred and transported around the country for use in greenhouses. In this state specifically, it's used quite a lot for pollinating tomatoes. And because of this, it can actually be a problem species for other bumblebees because especially by September, it can completely dominate. It's the only thing that we find out there. In recent years, it's become very, very common, and we do know that it can outcompete some of those rarer species. And the best way to identify it is that when you look at its abdomen right here, that very first segment is going to be yellow. The rest of it will be black. And then if you look at the length of its cheek, which is what we call the malar space, it's medium in length. It doesn't have a particularly long or short face. This is by far the most common bumblebee that you'll be seeing out in the field, just like this with that one yellow segment. The next most common will be the brown-belted bumblebee, still pretty popular here in Indiana in many habitats. Also, it's one of the few bumblebee species that actively seek out milkweed, and it's also one of the species that has bulging eyes in the males. This is because these males use those big eyes to perch and seek out females. And how we differentiate the brown-belted bumblebee, Bombus physiacalis, they have that first segment is yellow, but the second one will have this little arc that's rufous. The ocelli, which are little simple eyes that are found at the top of the head, they're just below this supraorbital line. And that cheek length, that malar space is very short. This malar space can be very hard to see in the field, but when looking under the microscope and looking at the taxonomy of bumblebees, it's a very important feature. But in terms of field identification, it's that rufous arc that we look for the brown-belted bee. And then next, the two-spotted bumblebee can look very similar to the brown-belted bumblebee. However, the second segment here, it's yellow instead of rufous. This is a very early emerging bee, and it tends to finish up around early August. It mainly nests in cavities in the ground, but they've also used dead snags every so often. And this is another common species that we'll find. Those ocelli are a bit higher on that supraorbital line. And that second segment, like I mentioned, it's not rufous, it's yellow. And it has a bit of like a two-humped structure here instead of that one arc. And that cheek length, instead of that short cheek on Bombus physiacalis, it'll be very long instead. So those three species, the common eastern bumblebee, the brown-belted bumblebee, the two-spotted bumblebee, these are by far the most common three that you'll find. I would say upwards of 3/4 or more of the bumblebees that you'll see out there will be those three. And the next species I'll talk about are a bit more uncommon, but it is still possible that you'll find out there if you take a look. First, the rusty-patched bumblebee, which I bring up because some of you may know this is our federally endangered bumblebee. It was last observed in 2013 in Indiana, listed as endangered in 2017, typically emerges very early. We know that the queens like to use forest and forest edges, though of course recently we haven't seen it in about a decade. So there's still a lot of information that we don't have about what rusty-patched bumblebees use in their nesting. but they mainly appear to nest in cavities in the ground, but they have been seen above ground, compost piles, and buildings. That's something that we still have to figure out. But the way that we identify Bombus affinis, the rusty patch bumblebee, is that that first segment and second segment is all going to be yellow with a rufous patch right in the middle. And that queen has a very characteristic notch on the second segment here. And it also has a short mouth space, just like that brown belted. So it has rufous like that brown belted, but it will always have yellow around that border. Next, coming into the bees that have a lot more black on their bodies, we have the American bumblebee. This is also becoming a much rarer species in Indiana, typically associated with grassland areas, and it does nest above ground. They're also quite aggressive, I believe, because they nest above ground. Their nests are more in view of other people. It has a parasite that we believe has been extirpated from the state. Those have not been observed since about the 50s. And this American bumblebee is starting to get a lot of attention. It's currently under review by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for potential endangered species listing. How we identify these is that thorax has black with a bit more black on the back, a little bit of yellow on the posterior side. That first segment's often yellow with 2 more yellow segments and then more black down at the bottom. And it has black right on the crown of the head and a ocelli on that supraorbital line. The black and gold bumblebee looks very similar to Bombus pennsylvanicus with a few key differences. They're mainly in open and savanna-like habitats. They tend to nest below ground. Their colonies are very small. The males have those big bulging eyes. They tend to perch on tall flowers. So Bombus auricomis, that first segment is usually black, whereas in the previous bumblebee, it had a bit of yellow, a few more yellow segments, and then black. And different from the American bumblebee, it's got yellow right on that forehead. The ocelli are below that supraorbital line. One more bumblebee, the golden northern bumblebee. It's a bit uncommon, and it may be a species of concern. It can also be a bit aggressive. They nest in larger colonies on the surface in grass clumps. This is also associated with grasslands. And this species has a lot of yellow on the abdomen. It has a very clear black band across the thorax. And then most of these other segments are going to be completely yellow, except for that very last one, which will be black. That's very distinct for this species. And the last thing that we're going to talk about are cuckoo bees. These are parasites of bumblebee nests. They're relatively rare, but you definitely could come across them, especially one species that I'll talk about just now. It does not have that corbicula, that pollen basket, because parasites, of course, they're not needing to collect pollen and bring it back to their own nest. They have a very wide head, and you won't often see them at flowers because they have a different ecology than other types of bumblebees. And by far, the most common parasitic bumblebee that you will see in this state is the lemon yellow cuckoo bumblebee. This is a parasite of our common eastern bumblebee, by far the most common one that you will see. These females are found in May, June, a bit early July, sometimes a bit later, and the males come out even later in the season, around August and September, but this can vary a lot. And how we identify these species, the female is the only species that you will see with an entirely black abdomen. That's very unique. They're often on the larger side. Whereas the males, the pattern can vary a bit. Anything from the first and second all the way to the first through fourth segments have the yellow hairs. But one thing that makes them distinct is that the hair is very see-through. It looks like they're almost balding. So those are our cuckoo bumblebees. All right, so we've been over bumblebee biology, some facts about Indiana bumblebees, and then common species that we found in the state. This is the end of the first video. The second video will cover the survey methods, how to photograph bumblebees, and how to submit your data to us. So we'll see you at the next part.